Hello, it's Jason Heath, Contrabass Conversations, and today we're doing something a little different. This is a historical document, what you're going to hear here. This is a recording of an interview between Henry Peyrebrune and George Vance. This is from about 10 years ago, and it was the basis for an article titled George Vance in His Own Words from Bass World, the International Society of Bassists publication. This is volume 41, number 2. And after chatting with Tracy Rowell and Henry Peyrebrune, they're both married. Henry is in the Cleveland Orchestra. Tracy teaches at Oberlin and does a host of other things. We thought, how cool would this be to put this audio out? And so you're going to hear over an hour of George chatting with Henry. And what we decided to do format-wise was to present this, but I jump in from time to time just to sort of set the scene about what the subject is. Now, the audio is not perfect on this, as you will see. It was not intended to be released on a podcast. It's this video that Henry shot of George, and it's just such a wonderful exploration of his life, his teachings, how he developed his progressive repertoire, materials, and it's just so wonderful. I know you're going to enjoy this. There is an extremely, sometimes chatty, sometimes not, sometimes very chatty parakeet in the background here. So that's what that is. But regardless, this is something that I think is so valuable to have out there, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation. And it kicks off with Henry asking George about how progressive repertoire happened to be published by Carl Fischer.
I was really pleased when he first contacted me to hear the name Carl Fischer, because everybody studied the Samandari book, know that name, you know. And it's really the first new publication that they've done in ages for the bass. Huh. You know, they had some, they had the Samandari book, and then they had a few pieces, transcriptions by Fred Zimmerman at one time. Yeah. But they hadn't, you know, on the back cover they list the other pieces for the bass. That page hadn't changed in decades. Yeah. So, and now they put that stuff on the back cover of my book.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Even though some of the tunes are in my book, no one bothered to cross-reference that. Like, you can still buy their old single sheet of theme, there are no pivots in that version.
Henry and George dig into George's background and how George happened to meet Francois Rabbath for the first time, which is such a major influence on his life. Much more on that as we get into this interview.
I didn't start playing the bass till I was 21 years old. But before that, I was involved in sort of musical subculture, playing the guitar in a pizza place in a band that initially started out as an imitation of Peter, Paul, and Mary. That was the 60s, and that was music that I was listening to at that time. But I was aware of classical music before my parents listened to serious music. And I had the idea that I would be a bigger asset to the band, because back then everybody played the guitar. Yeah. And everybody played the guitar and sang better than me. So I had the idea that if I took some lessons at the junior college in voice and piano, for instance, I might be a bigger asset to the band. But then, like all bands, we had a fight and I got kicked out. But I was liking taking these lessons. And I had a job, so I was just going there on my day off to do that. And I saw the other kids who were taking music theory and classes like that. So I decided to study music there at the age of 20. Then I had the idea that it would be neat to play an instrument in the band. They didn't even have an orchestra. It was a junior college in Arizona. So I told my advisor that I played the French horn in grade school. And he said, well, you can't do that. Your teeth are much too crooked. I was sorry that the guy who let me play the French horn in grade school hadn't said that, because he might have saved me some grief. You know, I quit because I wasn't getting anywhere. In fact, my dad said we should have bought a cow. It would have had the same sound plus milk. That wasn't the Suzuki method.
That's a pretty good line.
So when he said that I couldn't play the horn, I said, in that case, I'm interested in playing either the flute or the string bass. I'm not sure what it was about the flute, but the string bass idea I got from a Jimmy Stewart movie called The Glenn Miller Story.
Mm.
The guy in the back of the band looked like he was having a lot of fun. I found out his name later on. His name was Herman Alpert, but he had the nickname Trigger Alpert. I thought that was pretty cool. And so my original intention was to play like that, whatever that was, play jazz. And at the junior college, they told me the name of the fellow who did the bass lessons. And I called him up, and when he found out that I was 21 years old, he said, forget it. It takes 10 years to make a musician. Play the electric bass, it has frets on it. You're much too old. And I've never forgotten that, because at the time it made me mad.
Yeah.
It made me determined. So I called somebody else. My father worked with a guy who was in the Phoenix Symphony, and he recommended another fella who took me as a pupil, and I started to play. And I said at the time, so I won't quit for 10 years, if that's what it takes. After 10 years go by, then I'll decide whether I should quit or not. But in fact, the guy gave me good advice, the original one. I never should have done it. I mean, now when an adult amateur comes to me of any age, I don't turn them away, because I remember my own experience.
Yeah.
I didn't like that. But in fact, it was immensely frustrating to start at that age. I already was a person who listened to Beethoven symphonies and recordings and things like that, and a reader of serious books. And to be that old intellectually and not be able to produce anything on the instrument was frustrating. I think I was a pretty dense student as far as connecting the advice of the teacher to my muscles. What I did was perspire a lot without producing a lot of results. Because, for instance, early on I went to a summer festival, and I met a kid just coming out of high school who had been playing about as long as me. His name was Peter Lloyd.
Yeah. And
he was just going to go to Curtis.
Yeah.
He had started a couple of years earlier, like me, and he was ready to enter Curtis. So there were signs all along the way that it wasn't going to be easy to get anywhere with it. But I studied with a fellow at the junior college briefly, and then I had to transfer to the university. And at Arizona State, they had at the time they had a succession of teachers. Nobody stayed for very long. Yeah. There was a fellow named Larry Zagance there. I had him for about 1 year, I think. And then I had a teacher named Ring Warner. He was a Warren Benfield pupil. He was around. He played in Dallas, and he was a Chicago boy originally. He was principal of the Phoenix Symphony for a year. The best thing that he did for me was, at that time, I was getting frustrated that I had a wife and a son, and I felt bad that I didn't make a living. And I had already been, I had 3 different majors before I started music, so I'd been in college for like 6 years already and still hadn't graduated. And so I finally asked him if there was some place where I could make money playing the bass. And he said, oh yeah, I think you could get into either the North Carolina Symphony or the Birmingham Symphony. He called a friend of his, Jack Budrow, who was in the Birmingham Symphony, and told him he was going to send this guy down. They had an opening. But it wasn't like today where 50 people would show up even for a place like that. The day I was there, I was the only bass player that showed up that day, and they also were listening to trumpets and whatnot. I came a day early, and Jack met me and took me to his house, and he listened to me play. I think he didn't say anything to me at the time, but I know now that he realized that the situation was kind of a disaster. So he coached me a little bit on what to do and what not to do. Like, don't offer him the Hindemith Sonata, And I remember at the audition that the conductor asked him what he thought. He said, "I'm going to work with him. He's going to be all right." He wanted to do Ring a favor, and so they took me even though I was unqualified, really. and I played there for a couple of years, and I was supposed to be studying with Jack. But he was so friendly that it was more like I'd go to his house, he'd make sandwiches, we'd talk, he'd wiggle his sound post around for a while. And then I'd play something for him, but when I was playing for him, supposedly having a lesson, he was constantly saying, Tony told me this and Tony said that. He had studied with two people. He was the opposite of me, very facile. He had some lessons with Bill Ryan, and then he had some lessons with Tony Bianco. Tony was astonished that he made the finals or something. Anyway, he was very friendly to me, but he was constantly quoting his teacher. And so I determined to meet him, and he sent me to a summer festival in Ambler, PA. And that's where I met Tony Bianco. And right immediately, I had the idea that finally I had met the guy who was going to teach me. You know, I'd already had half a dozen teachers, but each one for a brief time. But this one seemed like it was destiny, you know.
Yeah.
Not to make it sound too grandiose. He has an aura about him as a teacher, as you know. There's a certain authority the way you have with certain conductors. You know?
Yeah.
He says something and you believe it. But it's kind of funny. Years later, when I was no longer officially his student and we were more like friends, I found out that his first reaction to me was that it was just a disaster and there was no hope. But after the summer festival at Ambler was over and I was going to go back to Birmingham for another season, I told him that I wanted to come and study with him during the year as frequently as I could. And he said, isn't there somebody closer you could study with, like in Atlanta or whatnot? But I kept coming up to Pittsburgh, and he kept repeating that, you know. And I found out later that he was just trying to get rid of me because there was no future for it. But I was so persistent that he didn't want to just say it outright. Now he's proud of me. But I feel like I was kind of not smart enough to realize that I shouldn't even be trying to do that. Because later I did take a bunch of symphony auditions and I didn't get anywhere. People thought I was crazy to quit Birmingham because I had some kind of job. And later I was in a military band, and when I quit that, people thought I was crazy because that was a real middle-class job. You know, I was just there when President Reagan raised the pay and for the Army in general.
Yeah.
And so I was able to buy a bass and a piano.
So you were at in Alabama for what, like 2 years?
2 years, and
Is that 70?
Yeah, I studied at Arizona State for 2 years, and then I went to Alabama for 2 years. I met Tony in the middle of that. And then I went to Pittsburgh and studied with him for 2 years, you know, thinking that I would just get some other job when that was over. But when it was over, the job that I managed to get was in the Army Field Band. And that's how I landed in Washington, D.C. And I had that job for 4 years. And, you know, I had a few lessons with a really great man then, but not regularly. His name was Steve Brewster.
Yeah.
You know?
I never met him, but one of my best friend in college, and he was my roommate, studied with him in high school.
That's what he liked to do. He liked to bring up the high school kids. He used to charge $20 for a lesson. He was principal bass of he could have charged a lot more, but I asked him why, and he said he didn't want to scare the kids away. He was like a guidance counselor to them. They'd come home from school. You know, they'd go on to college to study something other than music, but they never stopped coming back to see him at vacations and stuff like that. And Tony was a very strict teacher, and even though he was much more mellow when I knew him than when Jack had studied with him. Jack said that his teachers used to call him the Dragon. That he used to smoke cigarettes and pace around in your lesson breathing fire, you know. People would go out of there crying. But he wasn't like that when I met him. He had definitely become more mellow. But he also wasn't one to just throw out compliments to jolly you along. So it was like going to the doctor. You found out what was wrong with you, and then you went and worked on it. And I worked really hard when I was there. You know, he made it possible for me to go to Carnegie Mellon by just arranging a scholarship with the head of the school. I never auditioned or anything. He saw I was so earnest And he said, if you're going to make any progress, I have to see you every week. There's this thing of coming up once a month from Alabama wasn't making it. And so if I was going to get anywhere, he had to see me more often. So he just arranged for me to come to school there as a grad student. And I had hardly any classes to take. I just practiced for 2 years and studied with him. And it was a really pleasant time. But when that was over, we were so in awe of him that it never occurred to me when I was supposed to begin to feel confident as a player. I don't know when it ever would happen. But Steve Brewster was the first one to tell me that he thought that I had to be a bass player. That was his take on it. And so I had very few lessons with him, and one of the lessons consisted of me tuning my bass while he was making coffee in the next room. And when he came in, he said, "What happened?" He heard something in the way I was tuning the bass. And so I put the bass on the floor and we sat down and talked for an hour, and then I left. I made progress. And I don't know what he was thinking, but he encouraged me. That was different. It wasn't until I met Francois, though, that I found out what real encouragement is. And he thinks everybody should become a great bass player. That if you would just do what he asks, and he's asking you in the kindest imaginable way, that you'll become a virtuoso. And of course, that's why you're there, right? You want to be a virtuoso. He doesn't have, I don't think he has a conception of somebody who just wants to play the bass a little bit, to be sort of good, or because he likes being in the school band, or, some motivation like that. He assumes that everyone that he's looking at holding the bass would like to play like him. And he behaves as if it is possible if you would just do what he did. So when I first met him, the very first time I got a chance to play a few notes in front of him, he put his big hairy face in my ear and said, "You must become a very great bass player." I'm not sure that's ever actually going to happen, but it was, encouragement. And I have changed a lot as a bass player since then.
George also shares thoughts on his perspectives about music school and all these performers going after this limited number of orchestral jobs.
I think it's crazy that, I don't know what to say about it, but I think it's crazy how many people are in music school studying classical music, hoping to play in the number of orchestras who pay a livelihood in this country. And I'm happy to say that I am not in the business of producing more such people. As a person more or less devoted to the Suzuki philosophy, I'm thinking learning to play the bass and well is very good for your development and your character, and you can increase the amount of beauty in the world. But I'm not doing this to swell the ranks of people who want to go to music school. In fact, it's not necessary for me to do that, because there are plenty of them. And if I had a job teaching in a university, I don't know what I would think was my mission exactly.
Yeah.
No one's offered me a job like that.
So then in '82 you left the band and you stayed in DC.
Yeah, I tried to freelance around there, which is impossible to do. But one of the jobs that every freelancer in town has done at one time or another is teach at the DC Youth Orchestra. And they had a unique summer program where the kids came every day, Monday through Friday, for several hours, and they never took the instruments home. And it was a time when you could bring your child to sign up as a beginner on some instrument. So I happened to be the freelance bass player who was doing the job for them that summer. And the assistant director of the program asked me one day, why is there no Suzuki bass, no Suzuki method for the bass? Because the violin, viola, and cello teachers in the program were using those books. And I didn't know the answer because I didn't even know what it was, the Suzuki method. But he offered to send me to a Suzuki Institute for something called teacher training, because they did that every year with their violin and cello teachers. So he said, go take the cello class, essentially make a knockoff for the bass. And I agreed to do it.
George's progressive repertoire materials have had such a major impact on double bass pedagogy for so many people, me included. It totally transformed the way I taught the bass. But what did George do before he created this method? Here's George on the materials he was using prior to coming up with this method.
So what were you teaching with it before you started doing this? What were you using?
When I started to teach these two kids, my first pupils, I knew that I didn't want to use the Samandari book because it seemed dry to me. I was willing to go through it myself, but I was an adult and I was determined. Yeah. And somehow the sort of Prussian thoroughness of the thing, I know he wasn't a Prussian, he was an Austrian, but the Germanic logic of the thing appealed to me, but I didn't want to use that with kids. And I also had heard some other things, like there was a very well-known cello teacher at Curtis in the bygone era named Luigi Silva, who had the idea to teach from the neck heel first. And that seemed sensible to me. That
obviously you can hear that parakeet getting more chirpy, and he gets more chirpy and less chirpy as we go throughout the interview. So it'll sort of subside and then come back. But next up is George talking about how he realized that the bass was really kind of an inverted violin.
I thought that the bass is more like an inverted and inside-out violin than it is like an oversized cello. I think it's a big mistake that we always try to steal from the cellos, because you can steal more effectively from the violin, the literature, you know. So I had already had a few tunes that I had written down by hand of things that you could play there in the neck heel, for instance, the folk song Shortening Bread, I knew could be played there. And I had written out things by hand for my first two pupils, or taken some cello piece or something like that and adapted it for them so that they were playing stuff that was interesting. And I was groping around. One of the things I did while I was in the Army, I'm not sure why, was I started to transcribe things myself. I had studied with Tony, and I had done, he used a certain series of etude books and certain solos that he had studied. And suddenly I was on my own, and also because I was in a traveling band, I was pretty much out of the mainstream. I couldn't freelance much. I didn't have a regular teacher, and so I was on my own, and I just started playing things that I felt like playing. Like I liked listening to operas, so I play opera arias, or I had an old book of Stephen Foster tunes, and I started playing I Dream of Jeannie with the light brown hair and stuff like that. And somewhere, one of the guys in the band showed me an Osmoroid music writing pen. It's like a calligraphy pen. And I became fascinated with that, and I started to copy music by hand and make transcriptions, not realizing that someday that would be of use to me. Because I didn't grow up playing music, and nor did I have a facility where I could, for instance, make pocket money by playing in taverns while I was in college. I never did that kind of thing. I didn't start to earn a living from the bass until years later. I always had all kinds of odd jobs to do, and many of them seemed pointless at the time, that I really should be practicing kind of thing. And also when you get home from the job, you're too tired, you don't feel like it. But I learned how, I was a secretary, I learned how to type, and I learned how to copy music, and I did a whole bunch of things that seemed unrelated at the time, but later had a bearing on putting books together. Also, I probably spent more time, well, obviously I wasn't playing at all the bass until my 20s, so if I had been practicing throughout my childhood, I might not have spent as much time reading and thinking about other things. I've always been interested in other things, and I find a lot of musicians one-dimensional that way.
Next up, our thoughts on the Samandari method, of course, so formative for so many of us bass players, me included. And here's George and Henry talking about the Samandari method.
One thing that strikes me about the Samandari method is that after you're done studying it, you still don't know how to play the bass. There have always been enough people with extraordinary talent, the Tony Biancos of this world, who managed to play the hard licks in Mozart symphonies. They find a way to do it. But a person of ordinary talent still doesn't have the facility to deal with those kinds of passages using that system. That's what I think was one of the thing that was most striking to me about discovering the new technique is that not how it could make a virtuoso an even greater virtuoso, but how it could make an ordinary bass player into a competent bass player. How it could make things available to a person who wasn't in that elite group, who have always existed, and there are enough of them to take care of the orchestral positions that we need in this world. We don't need a new method to fill those jobs. What we needed is a new method to make competent bass playing available to anyone who wanted to do it. I think that's one of the overlooked achievements of the new technique. Also, when I told my advisor in the junior college that I wanted to play the flute or the bass, he suggested, he said, don't play the flute. They have too many notes to play and there are too many of them. Play the bass. If you can't play every note, play every other note and no one will notice. It turned out to be good advice. Perhaps he had gotten that idea from reading Berlioz's orchestration book, but Berlioz's comment about the school of simplifiers. They became expert at playing every other 16th note in a rapid passage. But it turned out he was wrong about leaving out the notes. We are expected to play them all. But it was good advice because he put me on to an instrument where I might have a future starting at that age.
As soon as you start teaching younger bass players, smaller bass players, the need for little basses becomes obvious. And George did many things early on to experiment. Here are some of his early experiments with little basses.
The first little bass that I used was actually a cello that I got from the instrument closet of the DC Youth Orchestra. And I had the idea to use bass solo tuning A and E on the bottom strings and to tune the cello A string down to G and leave the cello D string where it was, thinking that the student would have an easier time to press the notes down. This was for a 5-year-old. And we began, and after a few days he did succeed to stop a note. And once I was playing with him and I asked him, I played a note and he matched it, and I said, you see it's the same as mine. He said, yes, but yours is deeper. That's when I realized that he didn't want to play a cello tuned in fourths, he wanted to play the bass. So that turned out to not be the solution for the stringing of the instrument. And I tried several types of electric bass strings on the cello to find one that could be bowed. And I found one, flat wound, light gauge strings, so that we had an instrument that could be tuned the same as mine. And so he was playing on a cello with electric bass strings on it. Then I actually saw an instrument that had been handmade in that size at a festival organized by Rodney Slattery called Manchester Bass Week. It was his first presentation to the world of the York Mini Bass Project, and he invited Annette Costanzi and me along as sort of a Suzuki representation, even though I wasn't an official Suzuki anything at the time. No one had ever heard of me. But Annette, he knew Annette, and she encouraged him to invite me. And I took the same 5-year-old, the one for whom I had originally tuned the cello in fourths, with his cello, and we made a presentation there. That's where I saw an instrument that was actually made to be a bass for a 5-year-old in that size. By the way, at the Manchester Bass Week, Jeff Braditich, who was the head of the Bass Society at that time, was there sort of covering the event because he was taking an interest in anything to do with the bass, and he saw the 5-year-old playing and me working with him, and he decided that that was something that the Bass magazine needed to have a department for that. And he asked me to do it. He more or less elected me to be an expert in my field.
What was that, 82? Was that Manchester?
Something like that, yeah. And so it's a lesson. It's a lesson to me that you can become an authority in your field by accident, you know, and without convincing anyone of your qualifications. But when I saw the little bass that a French teacher had brought to Manchester Bass Week, I went home and I went to the shop where that repaired my instruments and asked him if he could cut the cello down, cut the shoulders and make it shaped like a bass. Because the 5-year-old playing the cello, we had the right pitches, but the shape of the shoulders didn't make it that easy for him to get the posture right. So he thought about it, and his name is Bill Gales Violin Shop in College Park, Maryland, Gailes. He thought about doing that, and then he decided that the architecture of the cello would make it difficult to chop it down effectively. He said it would be better to build an instrument. And when I inquired what that would cost and found out, I said, okay, I'll let you know when I can afford to do it, because I was just a freelancer at the time and didn't have I couldn't fund this sort of thing. But he got excited about it and started working on it anyway, without waiting for me to come up with the money. And he built an instrument that became the prototype for the 10th size bass. Subsequently, I showed that instrument to another shop in the Washington area, Weaver's Violin Shop, Bill Weaver, who deserves some credit for being a patron of this whole idea, because he had the wherewithal to cause a factory in Romania to copy that instrument and mass produce it, and also to make another model along the same pattern that we were going to call the 8th size bass, so that we would have instruments smaller than the typical K quarter-size basses that were floating around the schools at that time, that we could use to teach people at an earlier age. So because of Bill, those instruments are now mass-produced and made in Korea and China and everywhere. There were other people also that had the same idea at the very same time. Gary Carr was causing a factory in Japan to make an instrument that size with a cello neck. And he was kind enough to let me have one of the prototypes for that. So I had a couple of instruments that were really basses. And at Manchester Bass Week, I met a bow maker who was making some short bows for Rodney Slafford. His name was Roy Collins. Actually a maker of artist quality bows. He was just doing this out of the goodness of his heart. And I showed him the 5-year-old student that I had with me, who was playing on a short cello bow, which wasn't ideal for moving the electric bass strings. And I showed him my bow and how long it was in relation to my arm, and then I showed him the 5-year-old and said, make a bow that's that long for him. So he made a 10-size Pernambuco wood bow for him.
You have that bow?
I have the bow as a souvenir now. and I have the prototype of the original 10-size bass that Dale's made. I lent that bass to Francois Rabbath at one time when his own son was 5 years old. And he took it back to Paris, and the kid was jamming with Ornette Coleman and so forth. And when Francois had the bass for his son Sylvain, Sylvain, he had the Savarez company make strings for it. He had the clout to cause that to happen. And so now we have Corelli tungsten strings in all the sizes from 1/10 up to the big ones. And that was a huge breakthrough too, because I really believe that type of string is the best for learning how to draw the bow without extra exertion.
Here's George on the very first 5-year-old student he got. There has to be a first, and so here's George on that.
Did you say
I was telling you how I was teaching at this place where they had lessons every day.
Yeah.
It was ideal because the student wasn't allowed to practice alone at all. Every note that he played was under my direct supervision. And the way they got the students was that you had to be a certain age to participate in this program. But in the brochure for it, they said, but I think it was 7 or something like that, maybe 7 years old. But it said in the brochure that the bass was the only instrument that was accepting 5-year-olds. Because I had gotten the idea from Annette that I wanted, the part of the Suzuki method is finding out how young you can start. And it seemed that it would be ridiculous to make a bass smaller than a full-size cello. That was an arbitrary idea, but I let that be the minimum for what would support the sound. And that a 5-year-old could, a typical 5-year-old size child could play that. So it turned out that a parent who had brought her daughter to enroll in a violin program, and the 5-year-old boy was just tagging along, they found out that he could start on the bass. So he did. I was sitting in the room by myself on the day when they introduced the instruments, playing on a quarter-size bass, trying to lure in a customer. And so we started, and after a few days, I said this on the tape earlier about how I strung it with cello strings and bass solo tuning strings on the bottom. After a few days, he succeeded to stop a note. And then the trumpet teacher sent me a note saying, the following kids cannot get a sound on the trumpet. Maybe they would like to try the bass. And one of those came in and got a sound on the bass the very first day and became one of my first pupils, who later went on to study with Paul Ellison at USC. And his name is Artem Belton, and he was featured in that article that Jeff wrote about Manchester bass. He and Drew Zachary was the other one, the 5-year-old. Artem was a little older when he started, 7 or something like that.
One of your pieces is dedicated to Drew.
Yeah, Drew Zachary, my magnum opus, Bagatelle, is dedicated to him. And Country Dance was written because of Artem. Annette and I had started to put together some tunes, and we had 7 pieces at the beginning of the book. 7 pieces organized to start the pupil. We knew that we wanted to use the famous twinkle variation, but I didn't want to start people playing in first position. I wanted to start in neck heel. So I used this tune Shortening Bread, but just corrupted it completely so that the twinkle rhythms could be played on those notes. And so that we could start in the middle of the neck and then subsequently go back to first position and play twinkle there later. So as Artem was going through these pieces, we kept adding on to the first book until we reached a point where it would be nice to say this is the end of the book. And I wanted to have like a graduation piece from the book. And of course we were using folk songs and other tunes that have appeared in 1,000 different instrumental methods. Go-Talent Roadie and Lightly Row kind of tunes. But to make a piece, to have a piece at the end that would summarize what was in the first book, I found it necessary to write the piece myself because there isn't any folk song that jumps around and does all the stuff that we did in the first book. Because in the first book we introduced 3 positions. The neck heel, first position, and then the octave above first position, which is treated as if you're just playing in first position all over again. It's up there. That idea was something that was novel sounding to Annette because the cello doesn't do that. The cello's range is sufficient that they can play a lot of tunes in first position. They have a whole book and a half of Suzuki tunes.
Over 2 octaves.
Yeah. And of course the violin has 4 books all in first position. It's not necessary. But to me, since shifting on the bass is so crucial, we do it so much more than the other strings and do it without even thinking about it. You know how a violin player practice every shift in the piece because there aren't that many and where they are is important. But for us, we couldn't possibly do that because we're shifting all the time. So I wanted to introduce certain places on the bass as soon as possible. So in the first book we have a pretty big range of positions, but not a big range of notes available in each position. To make a graduation piece that did everything that was in that book, I had to resort to writing it. But there were certain things that I hadn't introduced yet. For instance, there was no place on the bass where the student could play the note C yet. Because I was introducing these nodal positions, but with just block fingering, and you had 3 frets available, just like in Samandari, but in these 3 places. So I was thinking about that one day on a trip to Philadelphia, what this piece would be like, and it occurred to me in my car. And when I got where I was headed, I stopped in the driveway and wrote it down before I forgot. And that piece is called Country Dance, and it's a piece in the key of G that has no C's in it, because the student doesn't know that note yet. Yeah. He hasn't used the C on the G string. It was a strictly utilitarian kind of piece, and the piece Bagatelle is the same way. There are certain things that the student knows how to do at that point. In Country Dance there are also no slurs, because they haven't been introduced yet. There are only 2 strokes. But by the time he plays Bagatelle, he can make slurs, and he knows a few other notes. Before I began what became these books, I was thinking about teaching the nodal points on the bass first. The neck heel, first position, which doesn't have an actual place to put your thumb to locate it, but for some reason we all find that easily as a place we remember. And then the 12th fret, the octave. My impression from my own experience in the Samandari book is that by the time you finally crept up to the 12th fret and put your thumb on it, one of the reasons why you sounded so bad is because the music had gotten complicated by then.
Yeah. Every etude is 2 pages long, and
right.
All 16 notes.
The first pieces in the second Samandari book are not simple pieces, but to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star up there is no more difficult than to play it in first position. So I think that's important, that they play all the nodal points on the bass early on, but play simple things. Because part of the Suzuki philosophy is that you're supposed to sound good at every stage of your development. You're supposed to make a ringing sound and playing tune and have good posture, operate the bow correctly, so to speak, right from the beginning. But Suzuki was a genius who laid out a way of doing that. So I had the idea that there were certain places that every bass player feels at home. Like in the Samandari book, one week you're playing in the key of C, the next week you're in D flat, and the week after that the sun comes out again and you're in D. So that one...
The correction, of course, is that one week you're in C major, and the next week you're in D flat, 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 and the next week you just go on.
Right. So my original intention was to teach those places first, just using whatever notes were available, and deal with how to fill in the cracks later. And so I would find pieces that I thought were useful, and then I would go and play them for Annette. And she would observe what I was doing and say, well, yes, that's good, but you just introduced 5 new things in this piece. She had that idea of progression of teaching points down. So she would help me to analyze what I was doing.
Next up is the Suzuki method, the sequence of pieces in the Suzuki method and how that all works. Of course, a major influence as George began to develop the progressive repertoire materials.
Each song introduces only one
right
point, and that you should sound good. You should succeed at it.
And the books are fairly slender because you're not supposed to turn the pages until you have mastered that.
Right.
Also, the Suzuki philosophy encourages playing the old pieces a lot. One of Suzuki's cliches was we develop our ability by playing the review pieces. Mm. And that's true for me too. You know, when I play a piece in public that I've played many times in public, I'm able to express myself with much greater freedom than when I'm doing it for the first time. So some people were astonished to see my books and how small they were.
Yeah.
You know, they have 10 or 11 pieces in each book, but they don't realize how long it takes to actually be finished with that material. There's a legend, I don't know how true it is, that Suzuki's ambition was to teach the Bach double violin concerto to a young person, and that he asked himself, if I was to do that, what would I have to do before that? And what about before that, and before that, and before that? And he worked his way back to the first variation of Twinkle, which begins ba 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 ba, Mississippi Hot Dog, the first rhythm of the Bach double violin concerto. And so Annette, having passed that piece of lore on to me, that was on my mind too. And I just arbitrarily picked the piece that seemed like a large piece to me in college, which was the Dragonetti bass concerto.
Okay.
That the last piece would be the Dragonetti bass concerto, the first movement. And what would I have to do before that to get to it? So if you look at those little pieces like Country Dance at the end of Book 1, or the Lorenzo di Gavotte, which is at the end of Book 5, you see that each one is like a miniature leading to that.
Closer, yeah.
You know, they have the same little tricks in them. They preview the Dragonetti bass concerto.
Something many teachers wonder about when they experience the Progressive Repertoire series is, do we need to do all these pieces? Do we need to do them in order? Can we pick and choose? And George definitely has thoughts on this. Here's his perspective on whether you should jump around and how you should approach that in terms of progressive repertoire.
It seems to me that in the beginning of the books that to really benefit from what's there, you have to go in progression. You have to start from the beginning, do everything, and do the pieces in order. That there's not. I mean, you can pluck a piece out of there to teach a kid and give them something to play,
but I never do that.
For the development, you need to follow. It's important to follow the progression.
Yes, some people can think of clever titles for books of children's music, but I can't. Huh. And so when I had to choose a title, progressive repertoire, as dry as it is, was all I could come up with. But that's what it is. It's supposed to supplant the idea of playing etudes, that the etude is embedded in the piece, and the teacher should recognize what it is. I mean, what is the purpose of playing lightly row at that point? And the teacher, if the teacher needs to supplement the piece itself by making up some little thing on the spot and showing the student, then he would do that. But I mean, the idea of these books is that the student would be enjoying himself. It would be a pleasure to play music. I didn't think a 5-year-old would want to play something like the Sonata, even though I was willing to do it.
Yeah. But not at age 5.
No. And later when I found out about Rabbath's technique and integrated those ideas into the whole picture, I still didn't know whether it was necessary to go through the Samandal layout of the fingerboard, or could we just skip all that and teach the nodal points and then add add Francois' left-hand ideas to that and be done with it. It turned out to be the case. I don't think it's necessary to play the Samandal method. And I've abandoned the idea of studying music that I don't plan to play in public. I don't practice etudes anymore. I have a whole filing cabinet full of them. But the problem with them is life is short and the public doesn't want to hear that material.
Yeah.
You know? So I try to have the students play things that they can play in public, but whether they realize it or not, the etude is in the piece. Each piece was chosen because it had some practical function at that point.
How does the Rabbath stuff fit in? Or where does it fit in?
In terms of the development of my material, what happened was that I had, with Annette, written what essentially became books 1 and 2, and was approaching the point where, or at the point where I was going to have to answer the question of now how do we fill in the blanks, because we could play all these places on the bass, but not the notes in between. And it happened, and I guess not by chance, that right at that moment I found out about Francois Rabbath. It turned out that, like Columbus discovering a new continent and planting a flag and saying, you guys build New York, Francois had already laid the fingerboard out along this line. I was unaware of it because I had been sort of out of the mainstream. I wasn't hanging around in places where someone might have told me about it. But when I found out about it, then that unlocked the rest of the... So at the beginning of the 3rd volume of my books, the idea of pivoting the left hand is introduced. And it turned out that I didn't need to teach more places than just the nodal points, because that's what he does. Except for, of course, half position really does exist. And that I put off teaching until the 3rd book, just because my original idea was that if I'm teaching a 5-year-old, he doesn't need to know half position. He's not playing in an orchestra, and he's not playing even in the school orchestra. Yeah. In America, anyway, he's not old enough to play in the school orchestra, so he doesn't need to play those low notes. And later, if I do have a pupil who's a beginner, but he's older and he needs to know that, I just tell him. There's nothing wrong with telling him sooner. But if I have my choice, I put off half position as long as possible, because it's a place where the leverage is bad for the left hand, and it's hard to get a clear sound. One of the decisions that I made, for better or for worse, is that the first book begins only using the top 2 strings, because I thought it would be easier to make a pleasant sound, easier to get the bow going on those. Actually, it would be better for the posture if we only use the middle 2 strings at the beginning. And there are some cello teachers in the Suzuki movement who also have had that idea, that they should be playing everything, the same tunes, but only using the middle strings. it hasn't caught on, and it's not going to go anywhere because they have
They've never done it that way.
their mass pieces that they have to play. But I like that idea in principle, but I don't like it. I mean, I like it as a way of setting up the posture of the student. But the crucial thing to me was having him make a beautiful sound right away. So in that case, I decided that we had to use the G string right away.
So what was the intended age range for progressive repertoire? Here's George on that topic.
After I'd been doing it for a while and had taught people of all ages, including adult amateurs, it finally occurred to me that if the pedagogy is good, then it's not just for kids.
Right.
I don't teach any differently when I teach an older person now, like an adult beginner or a high school student. They all have to play, all my students play the same stuff because I believe that it works. And if playing Twinkle seems childish, I just make some comment to put them at ease about it. You're older, so you're going to go through this very quickly, but we're going to do it anyway just to make sure we haven't missed anything. But in fact, even the adult enjoys playing and sounding good.
Yeah.
Playing lightly row in thumb position and making a nice sound on it.
How do you then say you have a 12-year-old beginner who also is starting the school orchestra? How do you do anything to integrate that?
If he asks me a question, like for instance the note C, a fourth above the open G, that is considered available in school orchestra music. So he has to deal with that note. And if he comes to me and says, where do I get this note? And we haven't gotten to the pivot idea yet, I'll just show it to him. Right then, because he needs to know it, and it's out of order in the books, but it doesn't matter. Same with half position.
So you address it as
I'll address
as
it
needed.
if it comes up, yeah. But if it doesn't, I just wait.
Here's the backstory behind these materials that would eventually morph into progressive repertoire.
It turned out that there were a lot of people in the bass community who were interested in the same subject. Besides Gary Carr and Rodney Slattery, who were actually trying to make something happen, there were other individual teachers who were trying to address the same problems. And when people heard about what I was doing just by word of mouth or by seeing the article in that Jeff Bradtich put in the Bass magazine, I started getting letters from people inquiring about it. And at first I wrote a personal letter to everyone and sent them a copy of the material and begging for criticism. Please tell me what you think of it. And nobody ever criticized it. They just said, thank you and keep up the good work. But when it got to the point where the volume of that got to where I felt like I had to start selling the books, sort of a mail order business grew up inadvertently on account of that. And the same thing happened with instruments, because people who associate me with teaching kids would ask where they can get things like that. And I ended up trying to provide them and trying to influence people to make those things. I'm not the only one, of course. But I'll tell you, the first time I saw a full-page color ad on the back of one of the professional journals, I don't know whether it was the NC Journal or something like that, but it was one of those magazines, and it showed a row of basses in all sizes going down to 110. I was astonished because I had nothing to do with that, the company doing it or putting the ad in. But I said, wow, I did that. And it had gotten so far beyond me that it was going on without my awareness, That's what knocked me out about it, is it wasn't me doing that, but somehow the idea had grown. Printing the books down at Kinko's kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I sent a set of them to, I made 3 envelopes to send to publishers. And I was at an ASTA convention, and I went around and looked at the tables of the different vendors there, and I talked to some publishers, and just got the name of the person I would send the stuff to, because I was very unmotivated to figure out how to have it published by someone else. I thought it was a good idea, but I just never made the effort, you know. And one of those was Carl Fischer, and I remember the lady at the table saying the name of the man, and he will answer you, she said. So I made these 3 envelopes and I sent them off and didn't hear it. And of course those letters always end, the cover letter always ends with, in a few days I will take the liberty to inquire, you know, what you think about this. And of course I didn't do that. I completely forgot about it. And lo and behold, about 6 months later, I got a phone call from Loren Kaiser at Carl Fischer, and he said, this stuff just crossed my desk. And later I saw his desk, so I understood. You know, he's a very busy man with lots of paper piled up. But he said, I saw it this morning and I'd like to publish it. So I felt good, because it was like he was asking me. You know, I didn't go beating on his door to make it happen. He looked at it and said, this is worth something. And they had just signed on John Deek to be their sort of bass composer that they represent. And they were looking for someone of an educator type.
George eventually went to Japan to meet with Suzuki himself and present these progressive repertoire materials to Suzuki. Here's a bit on that whole process, what that was like, what George learned. Extremely interesting.
How did you end up going to Japan?
Well, the original impulse came from the Suzuki philosophy, and Annette was involved with, or is involved with, that whole phenomenon, and it has an organizational structure worldwide and nationally. So she was hoping, and I had just naturally hoped to be plugged into that. Since I was plugged into it philosophically, I hoped to be plugged into it actually also. Yeah. I thought that their system of having workshops and arranging situations where many kids can get together from different places and play the same repertoire was an excellent idea, and that I would be part of that. So we submitted the material to the Suzuki authorities. There was some confusion there about what arrangements would be made to accept the material. And at a certain point, it seemed like the simplest thing would be to go to Japan and present it to Suzuki himself, because he had already seen the phenomenon at a couple of European workshops. The Europeans were very quick to, after Manchester Bass Week, to invite me to make presentations at their annual workshop. And so Dr. Suzuki had been present at one in Sweden and another one in Finland, where he had seen a room full of bass players playing Twinkle in unison. But because it was hard to clarify the situation here with the people the publisher, and anyway, we decided that at some point that I would go to Japan and just see what he had to say about it. And so I was lucky. It turned out that I didn't solve the problem of how to publish the material by doing that, but it was great for me, because I spent a month in Matsumoto as a visiting student at his school. It was a huge influence on me. And it turned out that he was a fantastic bass teacher. When I came to my first lesson, the first thing he said was that when he was a student in Berlin in the 20s, that he had heard many great soloists on the bass, and he said many specifically, like it wasn't such an uncommon thing to hear a bass recital. And he even specifically mentioned hearing somebody play Zigeunerweisen. So I assumed that he must have heard Kusevitsky at that time. It was a traveling soloist at that time. But there were others, apparently. And then I proceeded to play for him, and he was already in his 90s, and I think he enjoyed hearing the bass because the pitch was good for his... Yeah. He used a hearing aid at that point. The pitch of the violin was getting hard for him to discriminate. Yeah. But he had spent a lifetime thinking about tone and could make astonishing suggestions just by listening. People used to send graduation tapes to him, and he would listen to the tape and write back and say, your elbow is too high, and things like that. You know, from listening to a cassette tape, imagine, he could give a lesson. So to be standing in front of him with the bass, and he would just immediately jump up and say, you know, pull your input out further. It was great. And there I realized that at his school, people were playing along with the recordings constantly. And these were adults, they weren't children that he was teaching. They were people who planned to go home to whatever countries they came from and be teachers. But they arrived at every lesson with 2 cassette tapes. One of some great artist playing the piece that they were going to play, and the other one a blank to record the lesson, and his studio was set up like that. The lessons were pretty brief. At first, they would play a piece to demonstrate how they were progressing in developing tone. That piece for the violins was the chorus from Judas Maccabeus. And you heard that piece all day long, all through the school, because there were no practice rooms. People just played everywhere. And but in my case, I tried playing that for him. In my case, he preferred to hear Twinkle, indeed, as a tone piece. That was the first part of the lesson. And then he would sit down and light up a Camel cigarette and say, okay, let's hear your piece. And what I observed right off is that everyone was playing along. If you're working on the Sibelius Violin Concerto, it would be Jeanette Nouveau playing, or David Oistrakh playing the Brahms Concerto, whatever artist Suzuki admired, you would have a recording of that, and you would be practicing with that and playing along with it. And some people who came, passing through, teachers who came to visit, were sort of appalled when they saw that. At group lessons, for instance, he had group lesson every morning. There would be 40 violin teachers there on stage, and me. And they would play through many pieces in the violin repertoire, and if it was a piece that I could play, I would play along with them. Or when he just was demonstrating some idea, I would play. That's when I realized that the bass was an inside-out violin. Because when he spoke about the E string being the closest one to your body on the violin, it was the same on the bass. And that's when I realized that what was extreme on the violin, the bass is just the opposite. Playing high notes on the bass shouldn't be terrifying or unusual. That's where normal people can hear stuff.
Right.
What's unusual about the bass is how low it can play, which is why we play the bass. We like it, but not necessarily the first thing you should do. But at the end of these group lessons, he would call for whatever the big piece was that he was working on with them at the time. At that time, when I was there, it was the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto with David Oistrakh playing. And most of the teachers would sit down, but there would be 7 or so remain standing who could play it. And they would play it in unison. And I know some people were appalled, but when I saw that, I said, how many schools in America could you say, let's all play the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, and people would play it. And they would imitate the nuances of the artist that they heard on the recording. But far from being turned into robots, what I discovered when I tried it myself is that you don't become a carbon copy. That's impossible. In fact, if you could do that, then I'd be a millionaire. If I could make everyone sound like François Rabbath, that would be great. But that's not what happens. What happens is that the student gets a lesson that's entirely different than the sort of lesson you give when you speak to him about his technique. He gets a lesson directly in his muscles, because in the attempt to play along with what he's hearing on the recording, the muscles search out the way. You don't have to tell him you're playing sharp or flat or something like that. He finds the place. And to make the sound that's happening on the recording or the dynamic or whatever, the bow, he has to work out how to do it. And it's not an intellectual process, it's physical. So he gets a different kind of lesson, and he gets a lesson every day from a great artist, right into his muscles, and then that information travels back and and can affect his own musical imagination. So when I tell people, when I tell my students to play along with the recording, what I'm doing is giving them an insight into into the musical imagination of one of the greatest string players of our time. Because the reference recording to my books was made by Rabbath. Sort of like hunting rabbits with an elephant gun, but he was willing to play Twinkle and play it beautifully.
George, as so many people know if they use progressive repertoire, had Francois Rabbath record the reference recordings for these pieces in progressive repertoire, and to ask an artist like Francois with his unique sensibilities and approach made for some interesting twists and turns. And here's George on that.
Francois never plays anything the same way twice.
That's right, and it was an open question early on whether whether the recording should be made to reflect what a child could actually do. Like, for instance, are you going to put vibrato on Twinkle? It has open strings, but what about the other notes? A beginner probably doesn't have a vibrato when he's playing Twinkle, so maybe you should just play like that. And when I made a sort of prototypical recording early on, I tried to play like that. But I've changed my thinking about that completely. I think that they should hear the way a great artist plays. And then, of course, when Francois agreed to do it, I didn't feel like I could tell him in the recording studio what to do. And you're right, he doesn't ever play anything the same way twice.
Right.
So what we have is like a snapshot of one possible way to interpret each piece. And many of those interpretations aren't even the way that I play them in the lesson for the student. But I don't care, because when the student is ready to finally actually graduate from a book, having finished the book and started the next book and gone back and played along with the recording of the whole previous book, on some day he'll come and play the entire previous book straight through without stopping the CD and trying as well as he can to match the way it's played. I think he gets a huge, well, I know it, I just see the students who take that seriously and really do that make huge strides. And I have a hard time convincing other teachers of that. I think I might be, there are some things about the way I teach that I'm not sure that I have even convinced some of my best friends to try yet. They admire what they see when they come down there. And maybe there are practical reasons why they can't do everything the way I do it. And I'm not holding myself up as an exemplar of anything either. My attempt to imitate Suzuki, influenced by my experience of studying with Tony Bianco and Francois Rabbath, is just what I do. And then there's my personality too. I'm just the way I am.
They circle back to Tony Bianco, that major influence in George's teaching, and here's a little bit more from George about Tony and the lasting influence on his life.
I think I would like to definitely say somewhere in this thing that if I have a taste for teaching, it's because of Tony Bianco. Mm-hmm. I thought or I think, let's keep this in the present tense, I've always had highest admiration for his. I feel lucky to have been his pupil, to observe what great teaching can be like. I think that a lot of, just to draw my own conclusions from that. And teaching is a matter of character structure. Some people like to do it and are good at it, and others are characterologically unqualified to do it. One of the things I liked about the Suzuki setup is that they had these workshops for teacher training. And so I thought it was, that if you could just get a mediocre teacher that you could turn a mediocre teacher into a decent teacher just by giving him some information. But in fact, I've never run into a situation like that where a mediocre teacher came to the workshop. The ones who come are always the ones who are already very interested and have that spirit and drive to do it. So I like the idea of giving teacher training classes, but I don't know if I've ever influenced a bad teacher to become a good one.
It remains untested.
Because you can't get them to come to the thing in the first place.
Yeah.
I don't know too many people who make a living the way I do. It's kind of unique.
Yeah.
And I get rich in this. I've really...
You just teach privately and you sell books from basses.
Yeah, I sell the books and basses from my house. My wife and I teach music. And play an occasional job, although I'm happy to say that I don't have to play jobs that I don't want to play.
How many students do you usually have?
20 would be a large number. Right now I have fewer than that, but the year is young. I don't know if it would be possible to have even more than I don't know a way of advertising it all. Laugh, but I had a thought there that I lost track of. Something about I feel very lucky about being able to live like this.
Yeah.
And this whole thing has influenced my own playing hugely, because every day I'm repeating the essential ideas to people for whom they're new. And I haven't lost my enthusiasm for saying those things. I like demonstrating how to play Twinkle. And of course now I've been doing it long enough that I have had people grow up, and I get to also demonstrate some of the more complicated pieces. And I get to play the bass in public as a melodic instrument, probably more than a lot of bass players do. My only regret is that I don't actually get to use the bass as a bass.
Yeah.
Play great music. Great music has been written for solo bass. I'd like to hear about it. I mean, anything as great as the bass part of Beethoven's Third Symphony. A long time ago there was an article in Esquire. The publisher of Esquire was a violin amateur. He was talking to Raphael Drurian, who was the concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic. Drurian said that the second violin part of Beethoven's Third Symphony was better music than the Bruch violin concerto. And that struck me. It was wiseacring maybe, but I think it would be easy to say that about the bass.
Oh, yeah.
The bass part of Beethoven's Third Symphony is incredible music, and there's no bass concerto that can be compared to that. So I'm sorry that I don't ever get to do that. I mean, I'm willing to do it and heard like Groucho Marx. There are clubs that would allow me to join, but I can't complain because this nice work influencing people in a nice way and probably not doing too much harm. You know what I mean?
Here are a few more brief thoughts about Francois Rabbath and the influence on George's teaching in his life.
Yeah, let's talk about him. I think he's the Babe Ruth of bass players. I don't insult any other bass player by comparing him to Francois. When Pete Rose was about to pass Ty Cobb, some sports writer said, don't insult Pete Rose by comparing him to Ty Cobb. It's just a different thing. He's great, he's belongs in the Hall of Fame and all that stuff. But he's not Ty Cobb. How could he be? And it's sort of like that. I feel like I'm a bass player and you're a bass player. But Francois is something else. He's just completely unique. And so, he's so completely generous and kind about trying to pass on what he has discovered. Earlier I said something about him being like Columbus discovering a new continent. Just the discovery of his books made me a better bass player immediately. More reliability in the left hand. And then when I actually started to work with him and find out that he was really concerned about the bow, not about making the fingering system simpler, that's when I feel like a whole new stage of my playing began right there.
And we wrap up this interview with George Vance and Henry Peyrebrune covering Rabbath and the origins of his new technique, his multi-volume series. You may be surprised by some of this information. Also, they dig into George's vade-mecum book and how that originated and who it's intended for, and just some final thoughts from Henry and George.
He told me that he originally only planned to write the book that we now know as Volume 3, and that his publisher, the Duke, asked him to prepare some material that would be like beginner's material to that. Actually, anyone who's looked at his first book realizes that that's not something for a beginner. Yeah. But the first and second volumes were written after the third volume. And I am using those books now. I said earlier that I have dropped the idea of playing etudes altogether, but from Francois, I got the idea that if you practice the abstractions of music like scales and arpeggios and double stops that are in his third book, that means you don't have to practice etudes. Mm. So I prepared some material for gradually inculcating the idea of being a scale player to the student. You know, that it's sort of like Scotch drinking. Nobody's born with it. You can acquire a taste for being a scale player. And since I'm not dealing with the driven student who is planning to go to conservatory all the time, but in just the general public, that I have to train them to appreciate the idea of being a scale player. So I wrote a book called vade-mecum. It's probably an unfortunate choice because most bass players, when they call to order it, can't pronounce it. But that book was meant to be introductory material to the scales, the 3-octave scales in the New Technique Volume 3. So when a student finishes the vade-mecum, I invariably offer him New Technique Volume 3, and I make a big deal out of it that if he decides to purchase that book, which is quite expensive, that it means a whole new level of devotion to and time spent. Because when you purchase that book, you are saying, I want to be a virtuoso. That's what it's for. It's for purifying the technique. So I try to introduce it to the student that way. And I use the first volume of his technique. Ever since he recorded that book, I've been using it with the idea of the student playing along with the recording. And I don't give that to the student at a certain juncture in my series of books. It's that I choose when it seems appropriate to ask him to do another thing to have another item on his list of things that he's planning to accomplish in 45 minutes or an hour, or however long his practice time is. Of course, when we have workshops, if we're going to do a piece from that book, that motivates a lot of students to get the book. Every June, when we call up one of those tunes as a mass playing piece, we have a rash of, a lot of people asking for it. But after he recorded my books, he had that idea to record his own. Yeah. And I think it's a great idea that we would have that document.
Has he gone any further with that?
No, because he's been involved in other recording projects, like the Bach suites and recently the Arpeggione Sonata. But he did record the first volume, and I asked my students to play each cut on the CD. I don't start on page 1 and make them play what's in the book. Mm-hmm. I just want to hear every piece that has been recorded, and I want to hear it in both octaves, because I know from personal experience that all the pieces are written in half position, first position, and so forth, but that he also requires his pupils in Paris to play them an octave higher. And and they're recorded an octave higher.
So would you do this before they finish vade-mecum and begin book 3?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I would do it at whatever point the student is able to. One thing that I found from Suzuki is that he was constantly trying to push to see at what age, at how much younger you could teach a certain piece or something like that. He was always trying to, and he produced some very strange sounding recordings of Tiny Tots playing Chrysler pieces on miniature violins, and so forth. But it seems that the students will do whatever you ask them to do, but they don't necessarily do the things you don't ask them to do. Like, if you ask them to play in tune, they will. But if you don't ask them, then they probably won't.
Right.
And so now I have a young girl who's playing the new technique, Volume 1, and matching the nuances on the recording, because she regards me as a reasonable person who wouldn't ask her to do it if it wasn't possible. So it never occurred to me to start somebody that young on it earlier, but I'll find out what happens. And I suspect what I'll find out is that it's perfectly fine to do that.
What about book 2?
You know, he's going to have to record that or something. When I hear him playing it, whenever a student comes to a workshop and presents one of those pieces to him, and then Francois starts to demonstrate, I always think, wow, that's really beautiful and charming, and I should be working on that myself. But I've played through it, but I've never quite gotten it. But, you know, I know that in Paris, Francois has his pupils working on all 3 books simultaneously. It's not progressive. They're working on everything at once. And
I've tried to figure out how any sort of sense of progression to it.
No, I don't think he thinks like that.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have any training in teaching. In fact, I took 1 semester of music ed courses because when I transferred to the university, they tried to encourage me to go someplace where I might eventually find work, like become a school teacher. But I found those classes where you had to play other instruments really, I couldn't do that. I didn't like the sound of how to make an embouchure on the trumpet, and I couldn't get a sound on the flute, you know. That was frustrating. And I took 1 education class, and that seemed like the emperor's new clothes to me. So I don't have any of the jargon or lingo involved there, but if someone who did know all that lingo would analyze Francois, his style of mentation is not linear. It might have something to do with his Arabic background, or just the fact that he is self-taught, or just that he's an inspired man. You know, it's not just to say he's the Babe Ruth of bass players or something like that. I don't want to say that in a way where it sounds like I'm minimizing your achievement, for instance, or Gary Carr or somebody, you know. I don't mean it that way at all. I think he's one of the great people on the planet right now. And I don't want to sound like there are people for whom the new technique can almost become a religion. You know, it's not like that at all. It's just there's a reason why people are attracted to him. They want to be in his presence, and it's a known phenomenon. You know, he's one of the saints. He has that aura.
Yeah.
The reason they paint halos around the saints is because they had this thing. Everybody wanted to hang out with them. And that's the way a party after his recital is, you know. You want to be there with him. You know, he has this weakness in his nature, and that is he wants you to love him. You know, that's it. That's all he wants from you. If you love him, you can have anything. He's a sucker for that. And he's, you know, like he has the childlike nature that is spoken about in the Gospels, for instance, as unless you become like little children, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, those aren't just cliches. There are people like that walking around, and he's one of them. So, to me, it's, you know, one of the things that's happened to me personally on account of what I did, I thought what I was doing was kind of almost inadvertent, you know. I wanted to teach, and I like teaching, I like kids. For some reason, they like me. All that stuff was just happenstance in a way. But on account of that, many nice things have happened to me. You know, I get to hang around with interesting people, and I get invited to go to interesting places, and that's pretty neat. Because I certainly didn't scheme to make anything like that happen.
There you have it, folks. Boy, I wish we had more footage from George. I could listen to that for another 10 hours, but I'm so thankful that Henry recorded this with George. What foresight to have done that. And even though we had a parakeet chiming in, I just am so thankful that this was recorded and captured. And this is part of what I love about doing this podcast and having done this podcast for well over a decade at this point, just contributing to bass history and recording this bass history. I'm so glad that this is out there in the world, and I really hope you enjoy this. Again, this was published as an article, not as long, obviously, as this 90-minute interview, but an article in Bass World, the publication of the International Society of Bassists. And if you are not a member of the International Society of Bassists, join me, Henry, the organization that George was a part of, that so many thousands of bass players worldwide are a part of. isbworldoffice.com will take you there. Really hope to see you at one of our conventions, to see you interacting with us online. Come up and say hi to me, to Henry, to Tracy, to anybody who had George as an influence in their life. And I just thank you so much for listening to this. I'm Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.